Dean Martin, born Dino Paul Crocetti, arrived in the world in 1917 in Ohio. He was the child of Italian immigrant parents. His father was a barber who couldn't speak English. As a young boy, Dino didn't speak English either. He struggled in school. He dropped out in 10th grade. He ran with gangs, gambled, tried his hand at boxing. But he had one gift. He could sing. His voice was smooth, velvety, mesmerizing. In the 1940s, he started singing in local clubs. He changed his name, no longer Dino Crocetti, but Dean Martin. More American, more handsome, more sellable. And slowly, Dean Martin became a mask for a man nobody really knew. In 1946, he met Jerry Lewis. Jerry was young, energetic, and wild. Dean was calm, handsome, and cool. They performed together. Dean sang. Jerry went crazy on stage. Audiences went wild. That night, Martin and Lewis was born. For 10 years, they were America's most famous duo. They made 16 films.
They did television shows. They broke box office records. But behind the curtain, everything was different. Jerry was controlling. He wanted everything done his way. Dean just wanted to sing and go home. Tension grew. Jerry didn't take Dean seriously. He called Dean the pretty face, as if Dean was just decoration. Dean quietly seethed, but he never showed it. He just smiled, sang his songs, and went home. They split in 1956. They told the press it was friendly, but the truth was very different. Dean never spoke to Jerry again, not for 20 years. Jerry called, Dean didn't answer. Jerry sent letters, Dean didn't read them. Because Dean Martin didn't know how to forget, he remembered silently, and took revenge silently. After leaving Jerry Lewis, everyone thought Dean's career was finished. Jerry was the comedian. Dean was just a singer. But Dean surprised everyone. He launched a solo career. He released songs like That's Amore.
He made films. And in the 1960s, he joined Frank Sinatra in the Rat Pack. The Rat Pack, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, the Kings of Las Vegas. They sang on stage, joked around, drank. The world adored them. But Dean was different even in the Rat Pack. Frank was the leader. Sammy entertained everyone. Dean just smiled. On stage, he always had a whiskey glass in his hand. People called him the drunk. But the truth was this. There was no whiskey in that glass. Just apple juice. Dean Martin never got drunk on stage. He was just playing a role. Because he was the cool guy, relaxed, no worries. Nothing bothered him. But in reality, Dean Martin lived in a loneliness nobody saw. Dean married 3 times in his life. His first wife, Betty MacDonald, gave him 4 children. His second wife, Jean Bigger, gave him 3 more. His third marriage was brief. Dean loved his children, but he was never an emotional father. He didn't hug them, didn't say I love you. He just made jokes, smiled, and watched from a distance. His son, Dean Paul, wanted to be like his father. He was handsome, talented, he sang, played tennis, and he became a pilot in the Air Force. Dean was proud of his son, but he never said it, because Dean Martin didn't show emotions. In 1987, Dean Paul was serving as a jet pilot. One day, during a routine flight in California, his plane crashed into a mountain. Dean Paul Martin died at age 35. When the news came, Dean was at home. The phone rang. Dean didn't answer, because he already knew. Then someone knocked on the door. His ex-wife Jan had come. When Dean opened the door and looked at Jan's face, he understood everything. Jan hugged him. Dean didn't hug back. He just stood there. Then he walked slowly inside, sat on the couch, and stared at the floor. He said nothing. He didn't cry.
He just sat. For hours. On the day of the funeral, Dean came. He wore a black suit, dark glasses. He didn't talk to anyone, he just stood by the casket. For a long time. Then he turned and left, without looking back once. From that day forward, Dean Martin was never the same again. Dean canceled his television show. He stopped doing concerts. He no longer performed on stage. He stayed home, alone. Friends called, even Frank Sinatra called. "Dean, come on, let's do something together," he said. Dean replied, "Frank, I'm tired. I just want to rest." But the truth was, Dean no longer wanted to smile. That mask had become too heavy. In 1993, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. Dean refused treatment. "Leave it, enough," he said. Friends tried to convince him. Dean wouldn't listen. "I have no reason to live," he said. On Christmas morning 1995, Dean Martin died. He was 78 years old. At home, alone, the television still on.
His funeral was big. Frank Sinatra came. Shirley MacLaine came. Thousands of fans filled the streets. But everyone knew Dean Martin had really died years earlier, that March morning, when his son died. The years after Dean Paul's death were a slow fade. Dean's daughter, Dina, later wrote about finding her father sitting in darkness, staring at photographs. He kept Dean Paul's flight jacket in his closet. Sometimes she would find him holding it. Friends who visited during those final years said Dean had become a ghost. The man who once commanded stages and made millions laugh now barely spoke. The famous smile had vanished completely. His health deteriorated rapidly. Chain smoking for decades had caught up with him, but Dean seemed almost relieved when the cancer diagnosis came, as if he'd been waiting for permission to stop fighting. Frank Sinatra tried desperately to reach him during those last years.
Frank had lost his own son to tragedy decades earlier. He understood the particular hell Dean was living in, but Dean had retreated somewhere no one could follow. On that final Christmas morning, Dean was found in his favorite chair. The television was playing an old western. His cigarettes were on the table beside him. He had simply stopped breathing during the night. The coroner said it was respiratory failure, but those who knew Dean understood the truth. His body had finally caught up with what his heart had known for 8 years. He had stopped living the day he lost his son. At the funeral, old Rat Pack footage played on screens. Dean laughing, Dean singing, Dean with that eternal cigarette and that relaxed smile. The man on those screens seemed like a completely different person from the one in the casket. Jerry Lewis came to the funeral. It was the first time he'd seen Dean in decades. He stood at a distance, tears streaming down his face. Later he told reporters, "I loved him. I always loved him. I just wish I'd told him." Frank Sinatra delivered the eulogy. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Dean was my brother," he said, "not by blood, but by choice. And when he lost his son, we all lost Dean. The man we buried today left us 8 years ago." After Dean's death, his children found something in his home office, a collection of cassette tapes, recordings of Dean Paul singing, Dean Paul laughing, Dean Paul talking about his dreams. Dean had listened to those tapes every night, alone, in the dark, trying to hear his son's voice one more time. There was also an unmailed letter written to Dean Paul. It was simple, direct, everything Dean couldn't say when his son was alive. "I was proud of you. I loved you. I should have told you every day." That letter explained everything, the smile, the coolness, the distance. Dean Martin had been terrified of vulnerability his entire life, terrified of showing weakness, of admitting he cared too much, of letting anyone see the real man beneath the performance. And by the time he learned that lesson, by the time he understood that love should be spoken aloud, it was too late. His son was gone. And Dean spent 8 years living in that regret. Dean Martin taught the world how to smile. They called him the king of cool. But the real Dean Martin was a man nobody saw. On stage he pretended to drink, but the glass held apple juice. On stage he appeared happy, but inside was deep loneliness. And when his son died, that mask fell, and underneath was only a broken heart. Dean Martin entertained everyone, but he himself never truly smiled. Sometimes the strongest people are the most fragile, and sometimes the brightest smiles hide the deepest pain. The cool guy was never really cool. He was just a man who learned early that showing feelings meant getting hurt. So he smiled instead, and sang, and kept everyone at arm's length, until the day came when distance couldn't protect him anymore, when loss crashed through every defense he'd built, and all that remained was a father who never got to say goodbye. That's the real story of Dean Martin. Not the songs, not the movies, not the Rat Pack legend.
just a man who loved his son and never found the words until it was too late.